Welcome to the Sound on Sound recording and mixing podcast channel. I'm Mark Mynett, and in this episode we're looking at recording the bass, an instrument whose importance is frequently underestimated and misunderstood. Every project obviously will have its own specific requirements, but for the vast majority of productions, failing to deliver a powerful, punchy bass sound with strong note definition results in a production with reduced impact and overall clarity. From my own perspective as a producer, I often enjoy the additional creative input into a production that I get when recording the bass guitar, and this is because so many bass players don't actually have their own bass sound. They don't fully understand where it fits into the equation and the frequency content of the kick drum and the bass guitar, and this allows additional creative input from the producer, helping the bassist create their sound that will work within the production with them. Let's just start with a few 101s before we get into the actual recording side of things. There really are no rules with music production, which is art after all, but this is probably as close you'll get. And that is that it is really hard to overstate the importance of accurate intonation and tuning. Poor tuning contributes to poor tone, as well as instruments that, regardless of processing, are very difficult to effectively sit into a mix. And importantly, pitch shifting, melodyne use, for example, is not an option here, as intonation and tuning inaccuracies are non-linear across the fretboard. So again, it's really hard to overstate the importance of well set up instruments with accurate intonation, and importantly, for any recording project of any significance, new bass strings. Some people say, well, we'll just brighten them up in the mix, and it just doesn't work like that. Dead bass strings with brightness dialed in just sound like that. It just sounds like dead strings with brightness added. You really cannot replace that note definition and punch and brightness that you get from fresh strings. So accurate intonation, with the bass player preferably taking care of this before turning up for the recording session. New strings, and partly due to those new strings, make sure you're stretching them in and keep your eye on tuning throughout the session. Let's move on. Tracking a DI is good, basic, foundational engineering practice for any bass recording. Not only does this allow the signal to contribute to the bass sound directly, but it also enables the extensive options afforded through reamping and emulation style processing. A brief note here: is a general rule, and on an equal cost basis, active DI boxes convert a bass signal with less unwanted byproducts, for example, compromised tonality due to pickup loading, than passive DI versions. So I definitely recommend active DI boxes here. And just for clarity, the 1/4 inch jack signal leaving the bass should be patched directly to the DI box input, with the balanced XLR output routed to a mic pre. Then you should be looking at signal levels that average around -18 to -14 dBFS, and the through link output from the DI box routed via any pedals when relevant to the bass amp. Let's just stay with the quality of this bass DI signal for the moment, as due to its foundational role from which the amp cab sound and every other bass signal originates, it is really valuable to firstly assess the merits of your bass DI in isolation before considering where the through link output is routed. In line with its direct nature, without the filtering mechanisms of a bass amp and speakers, a DI signal should cleanly reproduce the fast transient peaks and articulation nuances of the performance. And this should provide a strong, wiry note presence. So you should really be looking for a clean and hard sounding note onset and a punchy, well-defined tone. A useful analogy here might be considering the clean, hard note onset of the lower notes of a piano. And that's ideally what you're looking for from the bass DI, this hard, clean, punchy note onset with a well-defined, clean, clear tone. And if your bass DI lacks this punch and note clarity, it could point to dead strings, or If you're using active pickups, insufficient life in the battery, it could be a substandard instrument or simply a substandard bass player, because of course a strong bass sound almost always starts with a strong percussive performance. So let's just have a brief listen to a bass DI recording here. This is without compression, without EQ. It's just the signal straight from the DI box to the mic pre. And hopefully you'll hear this clean, hard sounding note onset and this punchy, well-defined tone that I've been talking about. Despite the foundational role of the DI that I've highlighted, even credible DIs tend to lack the qualities needed for the bass to be properly represented within the rest of the mix, within perhaps a wall of guitars and big drum sounds. And this is because it doesn't typically have the low-end weight or sense of dimension and size. It's got these sort of strong, wiry note presence qualities, but without the low frequency content and the smoother quality that you will get from a bass amp cab mic combination. Now, I do appreciate that in this world of music technology, there's lots of emulation capabilities, excellent emulation capabilities, obviously from the likes of, you know, Helix and Kemper and Neural DSP, etc., that are absolutely fantastic. But first of all, we're going to stay with the amp cab mic setup, and that is usually because bass players who have their own sort of trademark sound have developed this in the analog domain. So we're going to stay with amp cab mic first of all. I think the first important thing to say here is when you're dialing in the bass amp, the first thing you should be thinking about is what the qualities, the general frequency content of the rhythm guitars are. And this is because if you've got a very mid-based guitar sound, you don't want to be having a similar quality in the bass tone because they're going to mask each other. You probably want a different frequency emphasis from the bass. So for example, if it was a very mids orientated, warm Eddie Van Halen Brown sound, I probably wouldn't recommend going for the same with the bass. I would let the guitars have more of the mid range and perhaps put the bass in the lows, and in the highs maybe more of a slightly attenuated mids focused bass sound. Conversely, if it's a very heavily mids attenuated guitar sound, very scooped, then I'd probably go for more mids in the bass, you know, kind of like getting that 300, 320 hertz note definition in on the bass. And perhaps because it's scooped in the mids, the guitar's going to have a lot of lows. I probably wouldn't put a lot of lows in the bass. And you're going to get the guitars and the bass to work together much more sympathetically. So with your bass sound dialed in at source, let's move on to capturing this sound. With the potential exception of bands focused on very slow subdivisions, perhaps reggae, or with bands where there's a lot of space in the music, perhaps sort of drum and bass, it is usually preferable to avoid solely miking a 15-inch speaker when compared to the tighter, more punchy qualities provided by a 10-inch bass driver. A 15-inch version is less efficient at responding to transient energy and tends to lack the type of low-end solidity required. And on the subject of speakers, if you really do have the time available and you're really seeking a very high quality bass sound, it's worth establishing which the best sounding speaker is in the bass cab. It's actually quite surprising in both guitar and bass cabs how different the speakers can sound. And the way you can do this is set up 4 microphones, obviously the same microphone, perhaps 4 57s, the same half on, half off the dust cap position, preferably away from the horn of the cab if there is one, and with the microphones in the same half on, half off the dust cap placement, record a take and compare the resulting signals at equal loudness to establish which is the best sounding speaker. From here, mic positions further away from the reflective properties of the floor are preferable. So if you're miking an 8x10, it might be worth purely focusing on the upper 4 speakers, or if you are using a 4x10, you might want to invert the cabinet, turn it upside down if you've found a particular speaker that's the best sounding speaker is one of the lower speakers. invert it 180 degrees so that your microphone is further away from the reflective properties of the floor. And lastly, it's also worth carrying out recording tests for optimum amp volume. And this can be made easier by setting up the bass amp in the control room with long speaker cables through to the live space if you can. Bear in mind that the powerful long wavelengths involved can quickly result in detrimental cabinet vibrations, speaker rattle or pulsations within the live room, and this is usually resolved with a more moderate amp volume. So these tests should partly revolve around making sure these issues don't impact the recording. Again, returning to the frequency focus of the bass sound and how this contrasts to the guitar sound, this should help you with your mic choice if you indeed do have the option of mic choices. Usually the typical approach is a large diaphragm dynamic mic, the ones typically used for kick drums, so your AKG D112, Sennheiser E602 or Shure Beta 52A, etc. Interestingly though, if you're really wanting to capture a very tight bass sound, it can be surprising how effective smaller diaphragm dynamic models are with a more pronounced low frequency roll-off. So your Sennheiser MD421 can be effective, but surprisingly, Shure SM57s can capture this really tight, punchy low-end quality, and particularly if you've got a bass sound that's really dialed in with low frequency content at source. So from a mic placement perspective, I can recommend starting with a half on, half off the dust cap placement, on axis, so with the microphone aimed directly at the speaker, and perhaps with the microphone around 3 inches away from the front of the speaker, which should give you a good, strong, usable tone that nevertheless can be improved upon. If you're wanting to enhance the low frequency content, you could marginally move the microphone towards the speaker, or again, if you feel it's a little bit excessive low end, you could reduce the proximity effect by moving the microphone slightly away from the speaker. But obviously you need to be careful that with greater mic distances, you get a less preferable direct to ambient capture ratio, and you also get increased phase anomalies due to the other speakers combining with the speaker that the microphone is actually focused upon. So let's have a brief listen to an amp cab mic recording. This is an Ampeg Classic with quite a lot of low end dialed in at source through a 4x10. And initially I found that a larger diaphragm microphone, in this instance an AKG D112, wasn't capturing tight enough lows. So I've swapped that microphone for a Sennheiser MD421, about 3 inches away from the half on, half off the dust cap placement, with the microphone aimed directly at the speaker. And let's have a brief listen to that amp cab mic signal blended with the DI. Again, no EQ and no compression. Of course, having discussed the analog domain of analog amps, cabs, microphones, we need to look at emulation, so amp sims, Kempers, Helix, Neural DSP, etc, etc. There are certain advantages here. Firstly, the standard of room acoustics becomes irrelevant, as does the quality of mic pre's for the microphones. And additionally, you can choose to change the make and model of amplifier, EQ settings, drive levels, and all other relevant parameters during the mix stage, which means that the sound is manipulated at source rather than a recording of the source. However, the potential downside of modelling replacing the traditional route is that most bass players who do have their own tonal identity tend to have this honed in the analog domain. So obviously the use of bass emulation is quite self-explanatory, but what I want to do in this podcast is consider additional layers for bigger bass sounds. So if you're really wanting a big bass sound, a very powerful bass sound, perhaps you've got a dense production with lots of orchestration, or for example, layers of guitar, harmonically distorted rhythm guitar, then you might want a bigger, more powerful bass sound to punch through that context. And the way that bass players generally go about it, so you think about bassists such as Chris Wolstenholme from Muse as one example, is particularly on their albums, they get a much bigger bass sound through having various layers of bass signals, often up to perhaps several, 6 or 7 different bass sounds. And this takes the form of a bass DI, an amp cab mic recording, perhaps 2 amp cab mic recordings, then an emulation signal, and then perhaps a separate distortion sound, something we'll come on to shortly. For this purpose, which is primarily to sort of thicken and strengthen the collective bass sound, it's preferable for the emulation to have a different timbre than the amp cab mic signal. So in this instance here, let's just have a quick listen to, this is actually the Neural DSP Parallax amp sim that I've just inserted over the bass DI, and I've made sure that this has got a different frequency, quality, and a different tone than the MD421 bass amp recording. And I've actually added a little bit of drive into this signal. It sounds like this. Let's just have a listen to combining the 3 signals that we've looked at so far, which is the DI, the amp cab mic sound, and the layer of emulation from the Neural DSP Parallax. And what you'll hear is we're starting to develop a really big, much more powerful sound that would hold its own that much more easily within the context of the production. And obviously the benefit here is that the software that I'm using, the Neural DSP Parallax, can be manipulated during the mix to optimize the way it complements the other bass signals. Further to an emulation layer in addition to the DI and the amp cab mic sound, a lot of bassists are turning to a separate channel of bass distortion. So in some productions, bass distortion helps separate the bass sound from other cleaner instruments. In some mixes, if you're recording for a rock mix, the quality of distortion in the bass actually helps it blend with the rhythm guitars, and you'll often find that you can get a greater level out of the bass when it's got distortion into it, because it sort of gels it into the rhythm guitars. And it also helps a bass sound translate on smaller speakers. The additional harmonic content means that particularly on smaller speakers, the bass will get reproduced that much more effectively, and the note definition can be just that little bit stronger because of the distortion quality. The danger here is that if you were to introduce distortion into your main amp cab mic signal, which usually constitutes the main body of the bass sound, this presents a number of specific challenges, because first of all, it's hard to preempt the most appropriate distortion levels and qualities for the context of the final mix. And so you can get the distortion levels wrong, meaning that you haven't an option for correcting this other than by reamping. Also, very importantly, distortion on bass can have a detrimental impact on the higher qualities. It can end up in a very abrasive bass sound, and then also a very muddy low-end quality to the bass. So here, by actually recording a separate channel of bass distortion, you can of course generate it at the mix stage from the DI, but for the moment we'll consider actually recording a separate layer of distortion. And this means that at the mix stage, you can frequency bracket it. In other words, you can heavily attenuate those muddy lows and abrasive highs and introduce it into the mix in a controlled way on a separate channel. You can pull it out, for example, during a cleaner part where the bass needs to be sort of like cleaner during clean guitars, for example, or push it further in at appropriate sections of the mix. And with this approach, I can very much recommend focusing the bass distortion on your mid-range when recording this layer. Of course, if you are recording a separate layer of distorted bass, this means that you'll either have to reamp to get this signal or alternatively use an active signal splitter to split the DI to different signal chains at the same time. So for example, the smart DI system that will split a bass signal without any signal loading. So what we'll do, we'll just have a listen to me fading in and fading out a separate channel of distortion into the other bass signals. Nevertheless, in the instance that you have a bass player who has effectively introduced distortion into their amp cab sound, and this blend represents the tonal identity, it's really important that this is captured as intended. So as a recap, we've looked at the importance of intonation, tuning, and fresh strings. We've looked at the importance of the foundational qualities of a good DI recording. We've looked at amp cab mic sounds. We've looked at emulations as an alternative or an addition to the amp cab mic sound. And we've looked at a separate channel of distortion that can be introduced during the mix as required. Thank you for joining me for this Sound on Sound recording and mixing podcast. Make sure that you join me next month when we will be looking at recording the guitar. Bye for now.
Thank you for listening, and be sure to check out the show notes page for this episode, where you'll find further information along with web links and details of all the other episodes. Oh, and just before you go, let me point you to the soundonsound.com/podcasts website page, where you can explore what's playing on our other channels.